Good morning to all and welcome to our first class of Philosophy of Arts of Top Up. Um, Philosophy of Arts is a very interesting course, and on its own, it stands as if it is so theoretical, but then when you look at it strictly, you see that it is connected to other philosophical disciplines. We cannot do philosophy of arts or what has been termed aesthetics in isolation of other philosophical disciplines. And that is why we have to divide it into various epochs to be able to understand its study and how it began. As outline of our course, as you must have seen in our presentation above, we shall begin today with a general introduction, and this shall lead us to understanding aesthetics of arts. What is this? Because philosophy of arts, generally the term has been tuned down to aesthetics of art. We shall look at aesthetics and ethics. We shall look at beauty, art, and judgment, because these three components, they are very necessary in carrying out any appreciation work of art. We shall look at the various theories of aesthetics. We shall look at the history of aesthetic theories, beginning from the Greco-Roman world, antiquity, and its development right to the contemporary world. Contemporary world, contemporary society. We shall equally look at aesthetic ideas in the Cartesian and Leibnizian schools and aesthetics of Baumgarten. Alexander Baumgarten and George Santayana have been considered as the co-founders of aesthetics. This shall lead us to see how Immanuel Kant develops aesthetics following reaction to those who came before him. And he is more of a transcendental aesthetics. We shall look at the aesthetics of idealism, and here we are going to the German school. We shall isolate in the first place Schiller, Schelling, Solge, and George W. Hegel. And this shall lead us to look at a different brand of aesthetics which Arthur Schopenhauer and Herbert developed. Equally, there shall be aspects of aesthetics in traditional African society. We shall bring it down here to see the special relation to works of art in Africa, so that when we look at some particular works of art in Africa, we shall be able to develop theories and make it more practical. And as we discover, although more of aesthetics in the contemporary world now is geared towards analyzing and appreciating the values that we have in African sculpture, we see that naturally Western principles were employed to interpret works of aesthetics. It is now that when we study aesthetics in traditional African society, we shall be able to look at the differences that this offers. From then, we shall look at aesthetics and core philosophical disciplines. Aesthetics and ethics, although we have mentioned it already. Aesthetics, metaphysics, aesthetics, epistemology, aesthetics, hermeneutics, aesthetics, and African philosophy, and aesthetics and African traditional religion. We shall look at it. So those are the basic things that we are going to treat this morning. And as a point of beginning of our course, we want straight away to have a general introduction. I'm sure you must have been hearing of the word aesthetics, and maybe in particular, there will be a confusion between aesthetics and philosophy of arts. You may ask, why have we captioned it philosophy of art when it is aesthetics? Philosophy of art is a general name. It's like a big umbrella that covers aesthetics. And aesthetics deals more with art, beauty, and judgment per se. But philosophy of arts extends it and connects it to other philosophical disciplines. So philosophy of arts, which we should very often use the term aesthetics, is considered as the theory of beauty, or more concretely, that which deals with philosophy of art. Equally, philosophy of art has largely concentrated on a careful analysis of art, dealing with concepts of expression, because if you imagine something that you cannot express it, it is dead upon arrival. Representation and the nature of art objects. And most talk or study now in relation to philosophy of art and aesthetics is about pleasure of imagination. However, as we go on with this science, aesthetics is seen, or the philosophy of art is seen as a theory of perception or susceptibility dealing with the study of man's relationship to objects around him and his tendency to value these objects. This explains why the study of aesthetics dealing with the sublime and the ultimate reality, initially from the starting point, we already start talking about the transcendental properties. They are so essential in interpreting any aesthetic works. The transcendental properties, as a reminder to us in our metaphysics, it deals with one, or unity, beauty, truth, and goodness. So these transcendental properties in appreciating the work of art, we take them in unison. And we are saying that they are here. One, any transcendental property of being is one, is beauty, is truth or goodness. We are merely saying that they are convertible. We do not mean that they are synonymous. What we imply here is that you cannot use one without implying the other. Equally, aesthetics and philosophy of arts here, therefore, as we'll see, as I mentioned already, it owes its name to Baumgarten. So Alexander Baumgarten. So the switch, or the traditional appellation of philosophy of arts, only came later on, after Baumgarten's official coining of the term as aesthetics, which for Baumgarten it was coined from the Greek derivative, and this has been uplifted to consist of philosophy of art and the philosophy of the aesthetic experience and the character of objects or phenomena that are not art, or therefore we are equally dealing here with non-art items. So we do not only limit ourselves to art, but we go beyond non-art items, and that's why we bring aspects of even poetry, music, dance, and when considering aspects of philosophy of art. Equally, here while talking about the role of non-art like poetry, music, and dance, there is a unitary notion of the aesthetic that applies to both art and non-art. But in order for that curious feeling, the experience of the sublime, invoked perhaps by the immensity of the universe as described by the magnitude of stars visible in the night or sky, to be aesthetics, or for you to delight in the beauty of a flower, we have to extend aesthetics not only to that which deals with art and non-art. And that is why we say, although we talk about the magnitudes of the stars and how they are seen, they may not strictly be applied in relation to arts per se, but we appreciate them in relation to their aesthetic value, since man cannot change the nature of stars as they are natural. So equally now here, as we are talking about other disciplines which are connected to aesthetics, we shall pull equally aspects of cosmology here. In another dimension, there is failure to do justice to the significance of artistic appreciation of various features of works of art that are not immediately perceptible, such as a work's provenance and its position in the artist's work or oeuvre. So there are some works of art which are not immediately perceptible. It is only after appreciation and looking keenly that we are able to arrive at the aesthetic value. Therefore, herein upon, we look strictly at a more accurate view, which represents two parts of the subject as being related to each other in a looser fashion than either of those positions recognized. As a result, both works of art and the philosophy of art and other objects can possess specifically aesthetic properties such as beauty and gracefulness. Therefore, in appreciating any works of art, we must take into consideration that although individual feelings and sentimental or emotional feelings always coming first, we have to guard against subjectivism and look more about aspects of universality and objectivity. If they possess, beauty and gracefulness, if they possess properties of this sort, they will also possess properties that are not specifically aesthetic, such as size and shape. Some particular judgments too are necessary, and they will be susceptible for aesthetic and non-aesthetic appreciation. As a result, we are open to now, after this brief consideration, we are going to consider what we understand as the various plans in aesthetics. In aesthetics, there are basically 7 plans that we'll consider here, but then we could consider more of some other plans. The basic and most important plan that we think about here is we'll look at the metaphysical plan, we'll look at the epistemological plan, we'll look at the ethical plan, we'll look at the socio-economic plan, we'll look at the politico-economic plan equally, and we'll look at the hermeneutical plan, and we'll look at religious plan from the point of view of especially African traditional religion and the point of view of African philosophy. And when we're looking at the hermeneutical plan, I want us to bear in mind especially the contribution of Hans-Georg Gadamer in his work Truth and Method, which he makes a synthesis of what Immanuel Kant developed from Alexander Baumgarten and George Santayana. So that is where we put a cap at this first part, and in a few minutes, if there are no reactions, we continue with the second part of our course. We now move on to the last lectures for the day. We are going to consider 2 major topics. Look at understanding aesthetics of art, and we'll look at aesthetics and ethics, although we shall see come back to aesthetics and ethics in the last consideration that we are going to have. In understanding aesthetic of arts, we have to consider 2 basic aspects. We look at signs and symbols, and second, we'll look at aesthetics and criticism. Criticism here in relation to judgment or aesthetic interpretation or appreciation. When we talk about aesthetics, understanding aesthetic of art, what do we mean? There are 3 fundamental questions that connect to this. The 3 fundamental questions that connect to philosophy of art, they are those arising only within particular art forms, those or set of related arts, those perhaps addressed to the same sense, and the next is those arising across a number of arts of heterogeneous natures, and lastly we look at those that are entirely general and they necessarily applying to anything falling under the mantle of arts. It must be noted at this point here that not everything of art is intrinsically aesthetical. So we have certain things of art which are not by themselves aesthetical. Thus the interpretation of art varies and often baffles the mind, whether understood or not. Therefore, when we talk about understanding aesthetic of arts, we have to subject work of arts in relation to 3 main things: analysis, that is a critique. You can praise it, that is giving positive values or negative, and criticism. Criticism now means a judgmental value that we pass on, and values here differ with works of art. So to the character of a work of art endows it with greater or lesser degree of a distinctive value. Therefore, according to what we discover in relation to understanding aesthetic of art in relation to philosophy of art, most fundamental questions about art would seem to be, which I'm sure you should be asking yourself equally at this point: what is art? Is it possible to distinguish art from non-art by means of an account that it is definitive of the nature of art, or are the arts too loosely related to one another for them to possess an essence that can be captured in a definition? Whatever the answer may be to this question, another entirely genuine general issue follows hard on its levels. This concerns the ontology of art. Like we said, in relation to the metaphysical plan, we cannot, the basis of every aesthetic work, we have to go back to the ontology of art, the kind of the kind of thing in the work of art itself. Therefore, some works of art fall into one ontological category, maybe particulars, and some into another, that is types. It is either particulars or it is types. So other important general questions which we may link to the one we have asked of what is art and whether it is possible to distinguish art from non-art would be what is a work's artistic value. It's very important to know a work's artistic value and which aspects of a work are relevant to, or those which determine its value. Another question would be, is the value of a work of art considered as art an intrinsic or extrinsic feature of it? So we determine, when understanding aesthetic, I would determine whether the value of work of art is intrinsic by its very nature or extrinsic. And finally, the final and the last question which I asked in relation to understanding aesthetic of art is this is about the nature of depiction of set of arts. How do we depict the nature of arts? It might be thought that the analysis of the nature of depiction has no special importance within the philosophy of art. For pictorial representations, maybe images, paintings, and the rest, they are just frequent outside as inside art. This will help us now to consider the two aspects I mentioned, the ones of science and symbols, and the one of aesthetic criticism. Science and symbols, in relation to understanding aesthetic of arts, are termed as indicators or otherwise seen as symbols of symbols. They are mere indicators. An example is if you have a signboard, you are going somewhere and you see a signboard written. I give you an example. Kali University of Cameroon, Kachuk Bamenda, and you see the arrow pointing at the entrance gate. You know that is a sign, that is a symbol telling you this is the direction, and it points. That signboard is like a sign which points to the direction you want to go to. So if you look at it, you cannot take the opposite direction. So to works of art, they always have signs and symbols. I want us to refresh our mind in contemporary philosophy, especially that of Jean-Luc Marion, who talks about the sign and the signifier. Particular signs, they don't point to themselves, but they are always indicators signifying another thing. So too with works of art. And this explains why so many contemporary artists are more concerned to express the fact that their works comprise symbols than to make those symbols denote something specific. So most works of arts they first of all present to you symbols, and it's from those symbols that we are able to arrive at what the real work of art implies. So to celebrate his perception of the reality of whatever it is he is perceiving, that is the artist's objective in painting. In order to know what the artist intends, we must look at and interpret the symbols closely. The second aspect here is aesthetics and criticism. Works of art fall into a number of readily distinguishable subclasses, and so we have to see how we do the aesthetic criticism, or we call it aesthetic judgment or aesthetic interpretation or appreciation. And we'll have here statements about literary works. They include like literary criticism. We talk about literary criticism because works of art do not only limit to artifacts and paintings or sculptures. They equally have non-literate works, sculptures or works that are not directly artifacts. There is also what we call music criticism. There is dance criticism, and so on. So these are just a few types of aesthetic criticism that we have. Literary criticism, music criticism, dance criticism. So we have aesthetics of dance equally and music. And here I want us to refresh what we shall see later on in relation to Pythagoras and the rule of mathematics in music. Those who are used to music will understand playing musical instruments, there has to be harmony. Harmony in itself is already a way of showing the aesthetic values that are embedded in the work of art, like in music, like we have said, and dance. That is, any statement about such subjects as poems, paintings, plays, statues, and symphonies. A critical statement is not necessarily critical in the sense of condemning the work. It needs not be a value judgment at all. No, is it necessarily a statement made by a professional critic? For example, if we read the work of Romeo and Juliet in the 5 acts and that of Yves Tanguy's painting, these are critical statements, whether true or false. What we are concerned with is giving the value that present themselves to us here and now. Now we look at the last aspect in our course today: aesthetics and ethics. Although we are still to elaborate on this when we are considering aesthetics and the core philosophical disciplines, it will be necessary at the initial stage now to make a quick background, which is necessary at this juncture. And this involves the contrast between ethical and aesthetical judgments, which has provided a good deal of the subject matter of aesthetics and stemming largely from Kant's idiosyncratic view of morality as a series of imperatives issued in accordance with the dictates of practical reason, while for him judgments of tastes are based on no principles. So Kant says while ethics deals with imperatives in relation to dictates of practical reason, aesthetical judgments they deal on tastes and they have no particular principles. And this explains why in reading or correlating or connecting aesthetics to ethics, we have to bear in mind Kant's categorical imperative that in every action that we carry, the action we carry in such a way that it can become a universal axiom. So in interpreting any works of art, we have to bear that in mind. We don't interpret it with sentimental values or individual ideas in our minds or subjective values. And this has led non-Kantians to argue that aesthetic judgments are primarily concerned as is art itself, with uniqueness, while morality has mainly to do with repeatable actions. So those who criticize Kant's view say that morality deals or ethics deals with repeatable actions, while aesthetic judgments they are concerned more with art itself, with the uniqueness and that which art presents to us. On a particular note, this tends also to separate art from other human activities, a separation which was encouraged by the collection of useful items by connoisseurs who took over as their vocabulary of appreciation the traditional language of religious contemplation. So we must pull in the idea and the work of religion and religious contemplation as a borrowing instrument, not as contemplating religious facts. And if we want to understand more in relation to work of arts and aesthetics, I will refer you to the work of Richard J. Bernstein, his work on Beyond Objectivism and Relativism. I think it was published in 1985. If you look at his work, especially on pages 118 to 120, we'll be able to understand better the position that aesthetics holds with arts. That is what we have struggled to do today. And so tomorrow, beginning earlier, the 8 o'clock, being 7:30 tomorrow, we shall consider our third lessons, and then we'll look at more aspects of beauty, art, and judgment. We shall have the class at 7:30. Then after that, we shall suspend it and come back at 10 o'clock to complete the classes or the lectures for tomorrow. Have a nice day. But if there are some reactions, you could forward them within 30 minutes of this class. In considering the question about aesthetic ideas in Greco-Roman antiquity, the question is raised whether aesthetics is to be considered as an ancient or a modern science, or it has several occasions that would discover that are so controversial when you can situate it. But then it was around the 18th century that actually aesthetic ideas or philosophy of art ideas surfaced in the Greco-Roman world. And our concern at this juncture is to highlight the expression of aesthetics as a science through representative or imaginative activity. The following are central in the Greco-Roman era. We'll look at the origin of the aesthetic problem in Greece. We look at mystical aesthetics in antiquity. We look at the investigation as to what is considered as the beautiful. Look at the distinction between the theory of art and the theory of the beautiful. We look at the scientific tendency that was found in Aristotle's thoughts in relation to aesthetics or philosophy of art. We look at the concepts of imitation and imagination, concepts of imitation and imagination that cropped up after Aristotle. And the last aspect will be in relation to speculation and language, the place or the role of language. To begin, we look at the origin of the aesthetic problem in Greece. The original aesthetic problem in Greek, I will see that several ancient authors did not exploit quite alright the origin of aesthetics. But then, a good number of them, beginning with Plato, they reflected on Plato's contribution, and especially what is linked to Plato's mimesis. But then, prior to Plato, art, the artistic faculty, only became a philosophical problem in Greece after the sophistical movement and as a consequence of the Socratic dialectic. So the Socratic dialectic contributed so much the problem of origin of the problem of aesthetic in ancient Greece. And the appearance of Platonic influence term, which served to group together the various arts and to indicate in a certain way their relationship, is what is known as mimesis, imitation. Aesthetics began, the first thrust was looking at works of art as more from the point of view of imitation, oscillating between the meaning of imitation and representation, which is seen as giving basis to aesthetics. In another dimension, other debates, which Plato later called ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry, ended up not being a true and proper philosophical discussion of the nature of art. And then after that, we see numerous condemnations of Plato, which sought to compromise or calling for an eradication of sensual features and criticizing Plato's idea of mimesis. The second idea we look here, the Greco-Roman antiquity is mystical aesthetics in antiquity. Here, after tracing the origin of aesthetics in Greco-Roman world, the mystical aspect is, this view considers art as a special mode of self-beatification, of entering into relationship with the absolute. So now this takes us to connect it with the idea of ultimate reality or the idea of the absolute, and we now see aspects of representation of this in the foundation of Neoplatonic school, like Plotinus. When we read the Aeneas of Plotinus, we see a wide range of what it reflects, stemming from Plato's mimesis and poetry in his Aeneas, aspects of the beautiful and the sublime. Equally, notwithstanding an objection that was raised as how possible we could have had expounded on the great limpidity or the clearness or the reason which is linked to art in higher places or activities of the spirit, there is the eradication of having accorded one of the highest places equal to superior being to philosophy itself. And this misunderstanding is in relation to what later on became the enthusiastic fusions about the beautiful that we read in Gorgias and Philebus in relation to the Symposium and other Platonic dialogues. Next to the idea of mystical aesthetics in antiquity is the investigation into the beautiful. The question now shifted now to investigation of beautiful and the search for meaning in relation to the content of the word beautiful. It attracted the attention of the subtle and elegant Greek dialecticians, using the example of the Socratic dialectic method. And in relation to this, Plato too later on examines this sort of problem, speaking of a beauty that dwells not only in bodies but also in laws. As a result, almost all was identified when we talk about the idea of the beautiful, or looking at the ideas of the beautiful now. Aspects of the true, the good, and the divine also came in, confusing also with Socrates' useful attitude. And therefore, in another realm, Plato distinguishes between beautiful in itself, or he makes true beauty consist in pure pleasure, free from all shadow of pain, or placing it in measure and proportion. The fourth aspect we consider in the Greco-Roman antiquity is distinguishing the theory of art from the theory of beauty. The conception of beauty, for the beautiful as such, taken as a whole, is also identified with art. But then, sometimes art and beauty, mimesis, are seen in Plato, and placing or displacing material of mimesis are clearly distinguished. In this regard, Aristotle notes in his Poetics that it pleases to see the most faithful images of things that are repugnant to us in reality, such for instance as the most contemptible forms of animal or corpses. In relation to this, we bring in the idea of the beautiful is one thing and beautiful imitation another. So the idea of the beautiful can be there, but the imitation fails to carry on that which is contained in the theory of art. So in this relation, we talk about paintings of horrible events are pleasing. For example, the Medea slaying her sons by Timocmacus, and Orestes the matricide by Theon, and pretended madness of Ulysses by Petrarch. So all these aspects, they produce themselves as being beautiful aspects, but they are very ugly scenes. They are not pleasing events as such. But then in relation to the Greek and the Greco-Roman world, we talk about Kalu, which is in relation to beauty as applied to artistic production and writings of literary critics, and Pulchrum, which is in the Roman world, which does not seem to be more than a linguistic usage, as we find in instances of Plutarch's beautiful imitation. Next, in this realm, we equally consider the idea of Plotinus, bringing in the idea of contemplating divine beauty through permission, which coincides with the good, which is the supreme condition of the Beatitudes. The fifth item we are looking at the Greco-Roman antiquity is Aristotle's scientific tendency. Aristotle, the affirmation of Plotinus and Neoplatonism is the first true and proper affirmation of mystical aesthetics, which is destined to such high fortunes in modern times, especially in the first half of the 19th century. However, Aristotle by no means agreed with the Platonic condemnation. Aristotle felt that indeed Plato himself had suspected that such a result could not be altogether true, and that some aspect of the problem must have been neglected. That is the idea of fortunes and the idea of the mystical combined with the one of fortunes in relation to aesthetics. As a result of this, Aristotle recognizes the rationality of mimesis in his general philosophical doctrine, and to assign it to its right place. And in it seems generally clear to Aristotle that mimesis, being proper to man by nature, that is as presented by Plato, is contemplation or theoretic activity. Although Aristotle sometimes seems to forget this, as when he confuses imitation with the case of boys who acquire their first knowledge by following an example. As a result, Aristotle departs from Plato's mimesis and talks about aspects which concern the nature of art. And for him, this is what he thinks that it is what we could state as the true nature of arts in relation to poetry. This is what it says. Poetry answers Aristotle. Poetry answers Aristotle differs from history. So Aristotle sees poetry as different from history, because while the latter draws things that have happened, poetry draws things that may possibly happen, and differs from science because, although it regards the universal and not the particular like history, it does not regard it in the same way. So according to Aristotle, therefore, or sooner, he attempts to determine the meaning of this axiom than he falls into contradictions and fallacies. But then in the final analysis, he says we should be able to know that that which is in a poetic work that cannot be interpreted falls short of mere recognition. After Aristotle, we have concepts of imitation and imagination. After drifting from the Aristotelian stance, the field of investigation in the line of Aristotle was generally neglected. Ancient psychology knew fancy or imagination, which they brought together to bear in the faculty in relation to interpreting works of art, in relation to sense and the intellect. And following, or as a reaction, several historians of aesthetics, they then now tended to attach singular importance to the correction of the theory of mimesis and the affirmation in history of the occupation of imaginative creation, since mimesis is merely an imitation. On the other hand, imagination without any need of models made them able to do what they did. That is, imagination was then considered as a wiser agent than simple imitation. So imagination now came to replace the mimesis of Plato, and it gives more form, like the other, not only to what has been seen. Imagination in this context is not quite different from the Aristotelian mimesis, which, as has been noted, was concerned not only with real things but also and chiefly with possible things. Socrates had similarly averred or observed that painters work or collecting what they need to form their figures from several books. As a result, as a continuation, Plotinus also, with hidden influences, considered a superior intellectual imagination or eye of a supersensible beauty when it is not a new designation for beautiful imitation, seen as mystical intuition. The last aspect in the Greco-Roman antiquity which we are considering is speculation on language. Now, the role of language was now seen in relation to the problem of nature, Fusei, and the problem of convention, Nomo. Now, these two are brought together to bear, and Aristotle looked upon words as imitations in the same way as poetry. And as a result of this, there was this observation that was made. In addition to the enunciative propositions which express the logically true false, there are others which do not express either the logically true or false. So you can see a work of arts and innate beauty and aesthetic values are embedded in them, but then the interpretation, due to maybe limitations of language or incomprehensibility, can bring about a difficulty in understanding a particular work of art. The last aspect we look at today is aesthetic ideas in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. In the Middle Ages and Renaissance, we almost see a chronological manner that which follows the Greco-Roman era. And at this period, there's an anticipation of ferments of thought of the modern period, which we shall see later. And this goes back again and centers to the issue of mysticism and ideas of the beautiful. Almost all the above traditions reappeared spontaneously in the course of the Middle Ages. Neo-Platonic mysticism continued, entrusted to the care of Pseudo-Dionysius, the translation of John Scotus Erigena and Avicenna. The central idea here in relation to aesthetics now changed the trend, and the Christian God took the place of summum bonum. So the good was looked on in works of aesthetics. And St. Augustine, later on, as we'll see, has an influence from this period. And here there are empty definitions of the beautiful by Cicero, and other ancient writers were repeated, and St. Augustine will come later on, as we'll discover, to define beauty, which takes up at the period in general in relation to the Middle Ages. St. Augustine used beauty in relation to unity, omnis pulchritudinis forma unitas est, that is, and that of the body as that of the part of the body, the colors, the sustainability, and everything brought together. We have to distinguish between something that is beautiful in itself and relative beautiful, which reappeared in a book of his. And so at that point that we end, and we'll begin with the other modern periods. Thank you. Reactions are waited. Good morning to all and welcome to our class in Philosophy of Arts. Yesterday we began with the history of aesthetics theory by looking at the Greco-Roman antiquity. And today we continue with ferments of thought in the 17th century. There are basically 8 elements that we're going to consider within the 17th century in relation to ferments of thought, in relation to aesthetics. During this period, aesthetics employs different terms. There's a departure from mimesis, mystical experiences, and other aspects of imitation, to basically these 8 aspects: wit, tastes, fancy or imagination, feeling, wit in combination in relation to intellect, taste and intellectual judgment, imagination and sensationalism, and feeling and sensationalism. To begin with, we have to consider that during this period, new words and new observations emerged, leading to the contemporary era, and development of aesthetical aspects around this period includes aspects which we have mentioned, which change the whole idea of looking at aesthetics not from the point of a mystical point of view of mimesis, although still maintaining the idea of the beauty, art, and judgment, but then certain old new words are introduced, and they emphasize more new aspects of artistic production and criticism, and complicating the problem and rendering it thereby more puzzling and attractive. The first, wit. Wit is rated as somewhat different from intellect, and the free use of it arose, and if we mistake, not from its convenience in rhetorics, because when we talk about somebody being a person of wit, it means that person has some grasp or some firmness in asserting certain aspects. So later on, in the dialectics of Socrates was shifted during this period, and Italian authors, together with French authors, decided to bring more new ideas in relation to considering the way of interpreting works of art using terms or concepts like wit. It was hailed as a presiding genius of rhetoric equally, and it brought about the idea of combining wit and beauty, and equally there is the idea that the part of the soul which in a certain way practices, aims, and seeks to find and create the beautiful and the efficacious. So the work of wit deals now with subtleties. And another dimension, we see that aspects of wit were used in relation to symbolic and figurative features, like in relation to statues, stories, devices, satires, hieroglyphs, mosaics, emblems, insignia, scepters, and even animated agents. Taste. If we can use just a simple nutritive aspect of being palliative, or even normally, even in relation to dressing mode, if somebody says that this person does not have taste, it means that the person does not know how to make a good choice. The person cannot make an appreciable choice. So the word taste is a second word used or concept used to describe the works of art. So you can talk about good taste, which was equally widespread and fashionable. And what this signifies is a faculty of judgment brought to bear on the beautiful, and is distinct to some extent from intellectual power, and sometimes divided into active and passive. So there is what you call active taste and passive taste. But traditionally, it was common to speak of one kind of taste as productive or fertile. It is either productive or fertile, or it is sterile. That is the negative part of it. And equally, metaphorically, the sense of judgment literally in scientific or artistic work, remarks such as for having had good taste in poetry, and the transfer of the word to the domain of aesthetics, that is of taste, seems to have taken place in France during the last quarter of the century, reflected in the following words: it is him who senses or loves perfect taste, Who does not love defective tastes? There is therefore a good as well as bad taste, and we cannot dispute this. The next element, or the third, is fancy or imagination. The features of imagination or fancy surfaced initially in the 17th century in Italy precisely, and critical contention in relation to this considers imagination as neither truth nor falsehood. So that which is advocated by some commentators of Aristotle. So it is through Aristotle's reflection on Aristotle's work that we have this type of ideas in relation to fancy and imagination. So that which is imagined or which is fancied, we can neither state whether it is true or false. Later on, the development commended that this is awakening images seen as necessary to familiarize with, since as a bodily feeling, because fancy or imagination is a bodily feeling, it assists in encountering the genus of imagination. It's like a sensuous faculty, so it deals with the senses equally. The fourth element is feeling. Clear opposition and controversies arose around this period about judgment by sentiments and those via principles. And the idea here is criticized that with art simply being a self-abasement, it sets aside reflective labor. And this was criticized from the work of Dubois, who were criticized as it makes a mockery of philosophers who deny the force of imagination. And difficulties and contradictions in definitions later arose, beginning with the German critics Borinsky, who isolated some ideas that penetrate the darkness surrounding the origins of modern aesthetics. So the most in relation to feeling in this case, especially in the German world, is the most important aesthetic doctrine which remained for modern times to discover was that after tastes, the rest for him was seen as just mere fiction. The fifth aspect is wit and intellect. So now we already looked at wit, but now we see how we can combine it with the intellect, taking aside the aspect of intuition. Here we have to distinguish between wit and intellect. Because although the two go together, we have to make use of the pre-knowledge about wit. It is only to a certain extent that wit differs from intellect, which means to a larger extent, wit and intellect, they move hand in glove. In relation to the intellect, intellect is defined as an internal virtue of the soul, which invents methods for expressing and executing its own concepts. It is recognizable now in the arrangement of things we invent, now in the clear expression of them. So the intellect only comes in to arrange concepts, to arrange and recognize things that have been invented through intuitive acts. The sixth aspect is tastes and intellectual judgment. So here now we are combining not only wit and intellect, but equally we are bringing in the aspects of taste, intellect, wit, and fancy. So similar views before the word taste, outcome of a metaphor, look more as was noted by Kant, whose effect was to stand in opposition to intellectualistic principles. Accordingly, others regard the taste as natural feeling implanted in the soul, independent of any science that can possibly be acquired by it. But intellect, on the other side, is not a naturally implanted feature in the soul. Man has to cultivate the aspect, man has to develop a clear intellect. So in depreciating this interpretation, Dubois avers that taste is more nearly allied to judgment than wit. So taste is closer to judgment than wit. And the Italian Ettori thinks that it may be generally described as judgment regulated by art. So taste is judgment regulated by art, regulated by art. The seventh element is imagination and sensationalism. In attempting to define wit and tastes, as we have noticed above, usually it leads to intellectualism, and it is easy to transform imagination and feeling into sensationalistic doctrines. For example, it is insisted that non-intellectuality of the fantasies and inventions of imagination, and this is what Pallavicino says. He says, nothing presents itself to the admirer of the beautiful to enable him to verify his cognition and satisfy himself that the object is recognized is of all, is not that which he takes it. By this token, we will state that from such act of judgment, vision or lively apprehension might remain in ourselves even when the deception of belief is corrected. In another dimension, we could consider this equally as that the conception of imagination is purely sensuous, and very often it is quite convinced that the faculty, if left to itself, would deteriorate into a riot of dreams and intoxication that links to intellect. So an authoritative friend who shall influence the choice of combination of images. So combination of images is very necessary to be able to decipher aspects of imagination and sensationalism. The last element is feeling and sensationalism. Sensationalism, on the other hand, upholders of this they think that feeling appears forcefully, regarding art as a pastime whose pleasantness consists in the fact that it occupies the mind without fatigue and has its affinities with the pleasure provoked by the territorial context. Thanks. The second part will look at the next aspect of aesthetics ideas in the Cartesian world. After expounding on the three basic features of Kant's aesthetics and making an allusion to the fact that Hans-Jost Gadamer, in his Truth and Method, expounds upon the importance and the significance of Kant's aesthetics, we shall now look at this last section, the aesthetics of idealism, and we shall focus on summarily on four German philosophers: is Schiller, Schelling, Solge, and Hegel. According to this, the third critique of Kant was the attempt to bridge the gulf, which means they take Kant's reflections to be very significant, and the gulf for them this resolved the antithesis between liberty and necessity, teleology and mechanism, spirit and nature, which preceded Kant's reflections. About this token, we look at Kant. We have to relate. The first aspect we do here is to relate Kant and Schiller. When looking at the relationship between Kant and Schiller, and the discussion rages around the true relation between Kant and Schiller has been maintained in relation to, as it would seem, the case of Schiller seen as deriving his thoughts from Kant, but from the pandynamism point of view. Starting with Leibniz, he uses Kant, but then he reintroduces aspects of Leibniz, which for him are very important. And in relating Schiller and Kant, it is important to note that Schiller introduces important correction of Kant's views when he obliterated every trace of the double theory of art and the beautiful, giving no weight to the distinction drawn between pure and inherent beauty, and finally abhorring the mechanical conception of art as consisting in beauty joined to the intellectual concept. So Schiller says Kant's the differentiation of art and beauty is problematic, and the two should be taken as one. For this reason, two aspects are seen in his reflection. He talks about the aesthetic sphere as a play, as a sphere of play. By defining aesthetic sphere as a sphere of play, the German Spiel, the unfortunate term suggested to him partly by some phrases of Kant and partly perhaps by an article on card games by Winston, which he published in his review, has given rise to the belief that he anticipated certain modern doctrines of artistic activity as the overflow of exuberant spirits, analogous with the play of children and animals. So beauty, according to him, in this relation, is life, the living form, not life in the physiological sense, since beauty does not extend throughout all physiological life, nor is it restricted to that alone. For example, it says a marble, when worked by an artist, may have a living form and a man. Although possessed of life and form, they need not be a living form as such. So this leads him to say that art conquers nature with the form. The second aspect is aesthetic and education. For Schiller, there's an ascription that high educational value to art, thus conceived as at once sensible and rational, material and formal. So there are four aspects here: the sensible, the rational, the material, and the formal. And not that it teaches moral precepts or excites to good actions, but rather if acted thus, or when it is acted upon, it would at once cease, as we have seen, to the art. Leading to this, we bring about the defects that have been underlined in Schiller's scheme. The defect in Schiller's aesthetic doctrine is lack of precision and its generality. Who has given a better description of certain aspects of art, the catharsis produced by artistic activity, the serenity and calm resulting from the domination of a natural impression. The next aspect we look at is Schiller's caution. He cautions us and the rashness of the romanticists. Schiller's caution, after constituting himself a guardian of Kant's teachings, Schiller introduces a caution, refusing to abandon the realm of criticism. He held that from transcendental motives, reason here demands that communion be established between formal and material activity. That is, there must be an activity of play, since the concept of humanity can be completed only by the union of reality with form. So, together with Corner, Schiller states that the union of sensibility with liberty in the beautiful does not actually take place, but is supposed to be so, and it suggests to man's intuition of the unison of these elements within himself. The next author of Aesthetic of Idealism is Fichte. Although Fichte regarded imagination as the activity which creates a universe, effects the synthesis of the ego and the non-ego, he posits the object and therefore precedes consciousness, that is an aspect of consciousness, and it does not connect it with art. He said that there are certain aspects of art which you are not conscious. It's just what is aroused by the artistic object or the image. In his aesthetic notions, he is influenced by Schiller, with the addition of a moralism imposed upon him by the general character of his system. Equally in his mind, the ego, which created the universe, can also destroy it. So the universe is an appearance at which the only true reality, the ego, can smile, holding itself aloof, but at the same time it can destroy it. So the ego that created the universe, or the image of the universe, can at the same time bring destruction of it. We look at Schelling's aesthetics. The aspects that we will concentrate about Schelling's aesthetics here is that it is a system of transcendental idealism, which was introduced partly by Kant, and it deals with philosophy of art squarely, especially in relation to the contentions around 1802 and 1803. And what Schelling does is he construes a relation between the figurative and the art and nature. And here he thinks he renews the consciousness of Neoplatonism in aesthetics. Therefore, for Schelling, art is beauty and characteristic in one. Characteristic beauty, or the character from which beauty is evolved, is not the individual but the living concept of the individual, according to Schelling. And this moves Schelling to reflect and to present the various aspects. Schelling presents three basic aspects. The first is art and philosophy. He says the two are connected. The second is ideas and the gods, art and mythology. This is a return to the Greco-Roman world, antiquity, and a reflection, in which addition to the above view for him is a dimension of imagination which, as a faculty, does not connect with pure intellect, or with reason. The last aspect is art, practice, and religion. So, according to aesthetics, according to Fichte, in order of hierarchy, art comes, and then practice, and then religion. And that is what he thinks that is very important that we have to consider strictly. So now we go to the last, George W. Hegel and aesthetics. If we listen to the last aspect of Schelling, we'll see the influence that the art, practice, and religion of Schelling, as derived from Solger, are basic features which Hegel underlines. And in Hegel's Phenomenology of the Spirit, Hegel states that religion is the last of the practical sciences. And so for him, the first is aesthetics, which is art, drawing from Schelling and Fichte. The second is practice, and that is the ethical sphere or the ethical plan. And the last for him is religion. Despite the minor differences separating Hegel from his predecessors, the same concept of art appears in his philosophy, although with substantial features of aesthetical mysticism. The core of his thought is found in the opening of the phenomenology and the philosophy of spirit. Discussions of art in the analysis of the forms of the theoretical spirit, among the definitions of sensibility and intuition, language and symbolism, and various grades of imagination and thought, are established in Hegel. Hegel places art in the sphere of absolute spirit, together with religion and philosophy, and he regards Kant, Schiller, Schelling, and Solger as his precursors. For like them, he strongly denies that art has the function of representing the abstract concept, but not that it represents the concrete concept or idea. As a last note, some of the critics affirm that the aesthetical movement from Schelling to Hegel is a revived Baumgartenism, and the ground that this movement regarded art as a mediator of philosophical concepts. We shall round it up today for today, and then tomorrow we shall look at Schopenhauer and Herbart. And after we look at Schopenhauer and Herbart, we shall be able now to come back home. This home, I mean African traditional society, or aesthetics in traditional African society. Thanks. Good morning and welcome to our class in philosophy of art. Today we are going to divide our class into 3 segments. The first segment of our class is we are going to consider a post-reaction to the philosophy of art or aesthetics of idealism by Arthur Schopenhauer and Herbart. And the second segment we shall consider the aesthetics in traditional African society with its religious implications. We shall, in the third segment, look at African art and sculpture. So that's how we are. We are going to look at African art and sculpture, art forms and religion, art forms and ancestral links, and aesthetics and African sculpture. So that is going to be the second segment that we are going to consider. So at the moment we look at Schopenhauer and Arthur Schopenhauer and Herbart, and what we should take into consideration in relation to these 2 authors is the fact that we have to put in our mind the main work of Arthur Schopenhauer, Will and Representation, which later on influences equally with the thoughts of Friedrich Nietzsche, his will to power, that has so much impact in relation to representation and the works of arts. Initially, Schopenhauer and Herbert, especially Schopenhauer, they chose themselves as adversaries against the systems of Schelling, Solger, and Hegel, and partly Fichte. But later on, in their thoughts, they thought they were departing from this idealistic philosophy of art, but later on they involuntarily returned to it. When we look at the features running through them, we see aspects which, in and by themselves, they already reflected in the aesthetics of idealism. The basic features which we find in Schopenhauer and Herbert, especially Arthur Schopenhauer, include aesthetic mysticism, again making a fall back to mysticism of the Greco-Roman world, which is in opposition to the idealism of Schelling, Solger, and Hegel and Fichte. We have equally ideas as the object of art. So, according to Herbert and Schopenhauer, ideas are simply represented. Works of art simply depict the initial idea or what has been conceived or perceived by the author. And then we look at aesthetic catharsis, we look at aspects of pure beauty and relations of form. So try to look at how those forms are related in relation to them. So Schopenhauer's theory, like Hegel's own, turns upon the distinction between the concept which is abstraction. We have to differentiate the abstraction from deduction, and the concept which is concrete, or the idea. Although his ideas are mostly linked to those of Plato, only slightly does it resemble that of Hegel and Schelling. So for Schopenhauer, the concept is abstract and discursive, entirely indeterminate in its sphere, and rigorously precise within its own limits. Only the intellect that suffices at the end, according to Schopenhauer, that only the intellect suffices to conceive and understand it. So therefore, what is expressed in works, especially non-literary works, is only expressed especially in speech expressions, so without need for other intermediaries. So the way and a piece of work, and this again linked to the idea of the speculation of language, and his own definition exhausts his whole nature. Schopenhauer is of the habit of calling ideas general of things, which again brings about the universality and solves the problem of universals which surfaced in the medieval period. And in consequence, according to Schopenhauer and Schopenhauer, each art has a special category of ideas for its own dominion. So we look at each art as unique, and that is why it says that architecture and in some cases hydraulics facilitate the clear intuition of those ideas which constitute the lower degrees of objectification. For example, dealing with aspects of weight, cohesion, resistance, hardness, the general properties of the stone, and some combination of light. And the final analysis, Schopenhauer concludes by affirming that music does not express ideas, but parallel with ideas and will itself. So we see now how he puts in the idea of the importance too of music, and then he borrows too and says that music, it led him to conclude that music was not, as falsely taught by Leibniz, arithmetic but a metaphysic. So you see this a derivation even from the Pythagorean consideration of music and mathematics in relation to harmony. So for him, art beatifies. It is the flower of life. So according to him, art is very necessary because it equally frees people from their desire, their pain, and their time. Next to him is Johann Friedrich Herbert, who turns his attention to aesthetic especially the musical aspect too, just like Schopenhauer, though in a slightly different way. According to Herbert, aesthetic must not bear the blame of the faults into which metaphysics has fallen. Therefore, he thinks that we should isolate metaphysical aspects from works of aesthetics. This is in a contradiction or contraposition of Schopenhauer. And he thinks that we must make it an independent study. Aesthetics should be an independent study and should detach itself from hypotheses about the universe. And beauty for him consists of relations. That's relations of the tone, color, line, thought, and will. And for him, experience must decide which of these relations are beautiful. And aesthetic science consists solely in enumerating the fundamental concepts in which are summarized the particular cases. In conclusion, the close similarity of the aesthetic doctrine of Herbert to that of Kant cannot be neglected. In Herbert, we again find the distinction between free and inherent beauty, and between form and the sensual stimulus that is attached to form. So we call it here, and in the next period, we are going to consider aesthetics in traditional African society. You are welcome to the second segment of our lectures today. And we are going to talk about aesthetics in traditional African society. And here we shall consider two basic aspects, basic characteristics, and we shall look at African art and sculpture. In the first place, we'll look at the basic characteristics of African art and sculpture. See that the aesthetic of art, nature, poetry, and beauty are expressed variedly in African traditional societies. And African art exists in many forms and styles, and with fairly little influence from outside the continent. Even within Africa, there are various art forms and characteristics that are very unique. You have basic unique characteristics in African art forms. And African art exists in many forms and styles, and with fairly little influence, as we have said, from out of the continent. But most of it follows traditional forms, and the norms were handed down orally as well as written. But then, because most of it was not documented, that is why there has been the temptation to use Western categories or characteristics to determine. But at the moment, what we're trying to do at this part of course is to be able to outline those basic features or characteristics that will help us to understand sculpture and performance art and prominent and abstract aspects, and partially abstracted forms as valued long before influence from the Western tradition. So whatever we're going to see, we'll try to apply it to our various cultures. You look at various works of art and you'll be able to practicalize them. So they're basically, there may be others, but then there are basically 5 characteristics in relation to African traditional society or aesthetics in African traditional society. The first is luminosity. The second is youthfulness. The third is self-composure. The fourth, clarity of form and detail. And the fifth is human resemblance. So we look at shiny luminosity. We look at most artworks in African sculpture. You see that most of it they have shiny, smooth surfaces, especially on facial representation. And they represent a significance of this is represent healthy skin. I want to, for the sake of practicality, of recent or before now, we have heard about the long story of the Afro-Comb and how it was returned because of the harm it was causing. But then I want us to forget about all those other mystical attachments to the Afro-Comb. I want to look at it more as an art form. When you look at this shiny surface as presented in most features, you look at it, shows the sign of health, representing health for the community. Likewise, the recent movement of the Fund of Nso to Germany in relation to, they call it, their founding mother, what has been known as, what were the Yan. So which has caused a lot of movement and to the museum with the hope of bringing back Ngonso, what they consider Ngonso. When you look at the shiny surface of the, call it the founding mother, it tells you that luminosity of the shining surfaces, it indicates that the mother still continues from the invocation that you could get the phone even uttering. It still shows that the mother still continues to take care of the health of the Nso people despite the present calamities. The second aspect is usefulness. In most sculptures in Africa, we have common depict youthful figures. We have a lot of gigantic youthful figures, and they are, as they show equally, that those which are not having such forms, they are a sign of illness and deformity. They are considered to be signs of evil. So therefore, when the renewal of most sculptures in most doorposts in traditional societies, they always contain youthfulness to show vigor and sign of progress and growth. The third is self-composure. Most sculptures in Africa and African aesthetics traditional society, they show the subject that is being controlled, having some proud and cold image, which depicts equally the fact that any person in authority is supposed to have such characteristics as depicted by those sculptures. The fourth is clarity of form and detail, complexity of composition, balance and symmetrical smoothness of finish. This equally connects to the study that is known in philosophy, Egyptology, that helps us to understand most of the pyramids of Egypt and of the northern and the Arab world of Africa, to help us to understand more of the sculptures that have their own uniformity and peculiarity. The last is resemblance to a human being. Most sculptures in African aesthetical societies, they are presented as gigantic features, which help us to understand better. There are some that represent ancestors, there are some that represent hero figures, there are some that represent leaders who have ruled with all dignity. So they try to depict it in order to help the society to know. Apart from these characteristics, 5 characteristics, we now look at African art and sculpture, the background information. When we look at the background information of African art and sculpture, the beauty of African art conveys various feelings and messages to the casual observer. If you just look at it casually, you may tend to look at most of them, especially those who have forms of nudity. You may tend to tell them as being pornographic, but then behind them they are showing signs of purity. However, true appreciation can only arrive through an understanding of the culture and the environment that influence the art. If we do not understand the environment and we don't understand the culture, we may tend to misjudge or misread most of the African sculptures and their facts. So it would be easy to understand African art better if it were possible to study with a few Western methods. But then, in the direct application, we must look at these 5 characteristics that we have enumerated above as being unique to Africa. The reason being that the majority of the books on Western art history focus on the changes in style and ways that various artists have influenced each other. And because there is no chronological record of style changes in African art, it cannot be studied in the same manner as those of the West. Primarily, sculpture was used as an additional language through which Africans communicated their inner feelings to the world. Things they could not communicate directly, Africans, they represented them in their sculpture. And the lack of writing in those days in African cultures resulted in an oral tradition where mythology and literature was recited from generation to generation. As a result, African sculpture has also served as communication between people and supernatural forces. And finally, sculpture may have indicated the wealth and status of its owner. Most of them have the wealth and status that could help them understand better. So, sculpture is the best known African art form. The primary materials range from wood, iron, clay, bronze, ivory, and textiles. And many African sculptures are heavily ornamented, and they share many of the same characteristics, such as arms held to the side, eyes in the frontal position, and weight equally distributed on both feet. Other characteristics include enlarged heads, large stomachs, large hands and feet, and protruding navels. I think it would be interesting to carry on a study of any work of art in their culture, and that could be a contribution that you could make. Who knows? In the study of aesthetics, especially in relation to its relevance and application in our African society. Um, that is where we end for now in this second segment. After the general introduction and outline of the course, philosophy of arts, since there are no reactions so far, we go on to consider the nature of aesthetic appreciation. As we indicated, the nature of aesthetic appreciation is going to consider a variety of things in relation to the metaphysical plan, aspects that consider metaphysics, as we already indicated, in relation to the transcendental properties and the idea of the sublime. We're going to look at the epistemological plan. We know the epistemological plan, of course, stems from the metaphysical plan, and in considering the epistemological plan, consider it as more of works or philosophy of art or aesthetical works. They stand as a source of knowledge equally, especially from the point of view of empirical knowledge. Now, we look at the ethical plan, and this will help us to know how to judge works of aesthetics, especially in relation to African art and sculpture, not to be too quick to condemn certain works of art as unethical, but to look at more at the plan from the point of view of the approach as a whole, integral approach. We look at the socio-economic plan. We look at the impact that it has in society, the impact that it has in relation to social interaction, the impact that it has, even works of art. We have seen a good number of artifacts, especially in Africa. We have seen a lot of recent return of most works of art that has had economic and social impact on the people, especially from the point of social anthropology. We look at political economic plan equally in relation to look at various, especially in African traditional religion. We look the impact that works of art have in adorning maybe royal palaces and adorning chiefs' palaces and African traditional religion too. We look at the hermeneutical plan. If we talk about aesthetic judgment, it is in relation to hermeneutics appreciation, to look at how do we do a critical analysis of a work of art. We look at the religious plan. From this point of view, we shall concentrate more on the African traditional religion, and we shall draw in aspects of African philosophy. Then we shall look at equally in the nature of aesthetic appreciation. We shall look at the cosmological implications equal in relation to that. So for now, when we talk about the nature of aesthetic appreciation, most of us have done literature, or we have heard about literature. We talk about appreciating a poem, that is analyzing it, giving its rhyme patterns and the rest. We equally import such a standard in judging aesthetic appreciation. And this has often been taught as a particular attitude of distinctive aesthetic appreciation, which deals with which is necessary for adoption in order for the item's aesthetic properties to manifest to all. This involves considering being in a state of aesthetic contemplation. Those in the spiritual realm will understand what I mean by aesthetic contemplation. But then if we look at from the point of view of Plotinus, this leads us to contemplating the one, which is the good. As a Neoplatonist, there is equally the influence which we shall see later on in the Greco-Roman antiquity, what this has in relation to Plato's mimesis. This aesthetic nature or nature of aesthetic appreciation to deals with suppositions or suppositious attitudes in thought as of one of the distinct interested contemplation focus on an item's intrinsic, non-relational, immediately perceptible properties. So we'll talk about aesthetic appreciation here. You see, we try in so much not to have interested contemplation. You don't focus on the work of art with subjective views. You don't focus on it with particular gain. You come in without prejudice or bias on interpreting work of art, and you should look at the work per se to be able to see how the values are subsistent in themselves. They are inherent in those objects, and so each item is supposed to be intrinsic, non-relational. You don't look at it of how it touches you as an individual or immediate perceptible properties, because there are some work of art which from the first view you may not even recognize the perceptible values that they carry. And perhaps too, the nature of aesthetic appreciation calls for us to view aesthetic awareness as disinterested attention to the product of masculine bias. Very often there has been masculine bias involving the assumption of a position of power over the observed object, a reflection of masculine privilege, an expression of the maleness in several interpretations. Very often works of arts have been interpreted with male chauvinism, call it male bias, so presenting that with male features to look as if they are superior to those of female quality. So we, in appreciation, we consider the sexes and everything the same, equal. We face them equally, and therefore another close idea is that awareness of an object's aesthetic properties is the product of a particular species of perception. Perception in this case is an idea which stands in opposition to the claim that this awareness is nothing but the projection of the observer's response onto the object. Very often the observer of an object projects that which is seen. I want us now to introduce or to bring close to view the ideas of Edmund Husserl in relation to phenomenology, what Edmund Husserl calls a poche or bracketing, that suspension of judgment. Although the observer is always carried by the object and projects very often the internal feelings, the observer should be watchful that in carrying on an aesthetic appreciation, should not be fast to passing on certain judgments until you have pulled together certain features, which we are going to look, especially when we come to considering aspects of beauty, art, and judgment. Concluding from the above opinions, it is fitting that we contend that an object's beauty appears to be relational. It is relational. It is mind-dependent property, and it possesses, in virtue of its capacity, to affect observers in a certain manner. You cannot observe a particular work of art without relating with that work of art and looking at properties which do not flow from your mind or your intuition, but which are in themselves intrinsic in the object. And you should be able to have the capacity of observing it, pulling it together, and relating with other subjects. Therefore, this leads us to ask the question: what manner is to be considered, and can attributes of beauty, which often aspire to universal interpersonal validity, ever attain that status? It is possible that attributes of beauty which often aspire to universal interpersonal validity can attain that status of beauty. As Kant himself responds, Kant in his response presents a conception of an aesthetic judgment as that which must be founded on a feeling of pleasure or displeasure. So the first thing that comes, according to Kant, is appreciation is always an idea of pleasure or displeasure. That is the initial stage, but we do not stay on that. And he insists that pure aesthetic judgment of an object is one that is unaffected by any concepts under which the object might be seen. So Kant says we should go beyond the feeling of pleasure or displeasure. And this he demonstrated by intimating that the implicit claim of such a judgment to be valid for everyone is justified. So it means that the value that is inherent in it has to be The judgment has to be valid for everyone, not for particular people, else it leads to relativism. Equally, an aspect, how can we, that is an aspect, how can we accept, how acceptable is his conception of an aesthetic judgment, that's Kant's point of view, and how successful is his attempted justification of claims of pure aesthetical judgments. The following topics address the concern and understanding of aesthetics of arts. That is what will help us to see whether, for true, Kant's point of view leads us to have a successful attempt at justification of claims of pure aesthetical judgment. We have to understand aesthetic of arts. We have to look at aesthetic of arts and ethics. We have to look at the dimensions of beauty, art, and judgment. We have to consider equally theories of aesthetics and the history of aesthetic theories. And this will help us to understand better the position of aesthetics in traditional African societies. And aesthetics as core philosophical discipline will help us more to come to an understanding of what Kant means by aesthetic judgment. We end here for now. I will give a pause and we continue if there are any issues to be raised. Good morning and welcome to our class in philosophy of arts this morning. The first part of the class this morning, we shall look at two main topics. The correlation between beauty, art, and judgment. And then we shall look at the theories of aesthetics. Concerning the correlation between beauty, art, and judgment, we look at these three components which are very important separately as art on its own, beauty on its own, and the various dimensions of beauty, which we have beauty and truth, beauty and goodness, and this will help us equally to refresh our memory about the idea of the transcendentals as we introduced yesterday. We'll look at the reality of beauty. We'll look at beauty as pattern and beauty as expression. And when we look at judgment shall concern these various aspects. Judgment concerns interpretation, appreciation, and literary criticism. Then the theories of aesthetics are basically three. Will be intuition and expression, intuition and art and philosophy. So those are the main areas we shall look in the class this morning, the first part of our lectures. About beauty, art, and judgment. Generally, we examining beauty in aesthetics cannot be complete without reference to art and judgment. And generally, art is used by George Santayana in a broad sense in his naturalism, as we'll discover, signifying the techniques and methods by which man alters his environment in order to make it more congenial to his life and interests. Summarily, we look at each of them. Art here in this case is concerned with the harmony and perfection of a total life. And aesthetic pleasure can be admitted into life only as a one sort of good among others. And since works of art are not aesthetically richer than natural things, a discussion of art, even of fine art, is at best subservient or secondary in a discussion of the nature and basis of aesthetic pleasure. The second aspect we look at is beauty. We consider it in the background as one of the transcendental properties, and we have straight away to avoid the dangers that has always been misunderstood in relation to artificial beauty. You hear many people say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Aesthetically, we use equipment of the transcendentals to trash this relativistic point of view. So beauty in this sense is as such alters nothing, and in some sense beauty serves no ends or purpose, meaning that beauty may not subsist on its own. Beauty is always inherent in a particular work of art. The experience of beauty signifies a harmony with the environment and in the soul. Beauty then is a value. So we must remember that it's very essential that beauty is a value, and like all other values, it exists only for living creatures with particular senses, impulses, and interests, especially the human being. And beauty, as such, to a larger extent, is pleasure objectified. So it's pleasure objectified since it is linked to human judgment. And we have various dimensions of beauty. Beauty and truth. Beauty is truth, and truth is beauty. This is from the point of view as we consider the transcendental property. But we are not saying they are synonymous, is that they are convertible. And we could always substitute one of the other and say, for instance, that the depiction of peace on earth and goodwill among men was a true description of the earth if it were beautiful. We are taking this from the experience of the Gloria and what we are celebrating at this time. Beauty and goodness. There may be other meanings, but there are at least three to note in relation to beauty and goodness. It is always considered in relation to useful, satisfying, and the moral dimension or the ethical dimension. Therefore, we cannot say that beautiful things are also always those which satisfy us in some other way. Certainly, not all things which give us any satisfaction are beautiful. The reality of beauty. If there are right and wrong opinions about beauty, then it will seem that it must be a character of the things which are beautiful, so that we might make a mistake in calling them so. If, on the other hand, the so-called beauty of things is really only the result of an attitude of ours towards them, for instance, that of giving them a meaning or significance, then it might seem that we must know whether we are in that attitude to them or not, and can never be wrong in thinking things beautiful any more than we can be wrong in thinking them agreeable, unexpected, or welcome. I'll leave the aspect of beauty as pattern. That one is easy. You can research on that on your own. And the idea of beauty as expression, which is found mostly in relation to expressive modes of feelings. We look at judgment, the last. Values spring, when we talk about judgment, values spring from the immediate and inexplicable reaction of vital impulse and from the irrational part of our nature. In other words, no final reason can be given for man's preferences in arts, morals, or in practical matters of earning a living. An application of judgment in this sense points to the fact that the ideal itself, however, is judged by no rule or standard other than that it appeals to and finds its ultimate justification in human nature. One ideal can be judged, if at all, only in terms of a more inclusive or larger ideal. At this instance, we want to consider that we cannot isolate aesthetics or philosophy of art from hermeneutics, and it is here that we talk about appreciation, interpretation, and literary criticism. That is it for beauty, art, and judgment. We now look at the theories of aesthetics. The theories of aesthetics touches on four basic items: intuition and expression, intuition and art and philosophy, historicism and intellectualism in aesthetics. And this will understand this better when we come to a history of aesthetic theories, beginning from the Greco-Roman world. First, let us look at intuition and expression. This aspect of aesthetics deals with intuitive knowledge in its independence with respect to intellectual knowledge, intuition, and perception. Equally, it relates to aspects of intuition which deal with the concepts of space and time, sensation, association, representation, and expression. However, to declare the independence of intuition as regards concepts does not suffice to give a true and precise idea of intuition. So we may not underline intuition in relation to its expression if we do not connect it to concepts, because that which the individual intuits, unless it is expressed and is being read or interpreted directly in the work of art, we cannot get into the mind of the person who intuited. Intuition and art, there are or deal with corollaries and explanations with the identity of art and intuitive knowledge presenting to specific difference of intensity. The difference is only extensive and empirical. So when we talk about intuition and art, well, it's only empirical. We only see that which the artist intuited from the mood, how the artist has expressed in the work of art. Then we look at the last aspect with the art and philosophy. The two forms of knowledge, aesthetics and intellectual or conceptual, are indeed different, but this does not altogether amount to separation and disjunction as of two forces, each pulling in its own direction. Therefore, by implication, there is a suggestion here in relation to art and philosophy that there is a thought that cannot exist. Thought cannot exist without speech, a truth generally admitted. That which is taught must be expressed, and it can only be expressed within the philosophical realm. And as such, it is important for any work of art to be expressed in a form worthy of easy comprehension. We'll rest our case today, at the first part, and the second part of the course today, we shall look at the history of aesthetic theories, and if there is anything to react about, we'll indicate. Then we'll see during the second part beginning at 10 a.m. Thank you. Once more, good morning and welcome to our class, the second part of the class in history of philosophy, history of arts. I want to apologize that we are beginning some few minutes late because of poor connections and some unforeseen contingencies. So in this second part today, we are going to deal with the history of aesthetic theories, and we shall base ourselves beginning with the aesthetic ideas in Greco-Roman antiquity, and we shall look briefly at aesthetic ideas in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Concerning aesthetic ideas in Greco-Roman antiquity, there are basically 7 features that we shall consider. We shall look at origin of the aesthetic problem in Greece. We look at issues of mystical aesthetics in antiquity. We'll look at the investigation into the beautiful. We'll look at distinguishing the theory of art from the theory of beauty. And we'll look at Aristotle's scientific tendency, concepts of imitation and imagination after Aristotle. And then the last aspect we shall consider is speculation on language, given the place that language has and aesthetics. It is only after that we shall concentrate to see a few indications as to what aesthetic ideas in the Middle Ages and Renaissance are all about. Then in detail we shall explain each of the 7 features of aesthetics in the Greco-Roman world, and then we shall look at what the Middle Ages and the Renaissance they have to offer, which they flood open the door to modern ideas of modern aesthetics or modern philosophy of art that will help us to understand basically how the contemporary society looks like. After looking at the beginning of ferments of thought in the 17th century, there's a second aspect of our lecture this morning. We are going to look at aesthetic ideas in the Cartesian and Leibnizian schools and the aesthetics of Alexander Baumgarten. We shall treat aspects here relating to Cartesianism and imagination. We shall look aspects of the English John Locke and the Scottish school. We shall look aspects of Leibniz's petty perceptions and confused knowledge. We shall equally touch on Johann Christian Wolff. We shall look at the aesthetics of Alexander Baumgarten, and 2 aspects shall feature in his thoughts here. His idea of aesthetics as science of sensory consciousness, and his idea of intellectualism. To begin with, Cartesianism and imagination. You're all welcome to the last part of our class today, 29th of December 2022. There are two basic aspects that we're going to treat today, or two major topics that we're going to treat in this last part. We are going to look at Immanuel Kant and aesthetics, and we are going to look at the aesthetics of idealism, and here we shall examine aspects of aesthetics according to Schiller, Schelling, Solge, and Hegel. In the first part, we look at Immanuel Kant and aesthetics. Considering this, there are three basic features that I want us to bear in mind. The first is imagination in Kant's system. The second is Kant's differentiation of theory of beauty from theory of art. And the third is the mystical features in Kant's theory of beauty. Prior to this, I want us to understand that the basic characteristics or the basic description of Kant's metaphysics as speculative metaphysics will help us to understand better what we are about to do, or the explanation we're about to have here. And after looking at that, we'll look at the aesthetics of idealism of Schiller, Schelling, Solge, and Hegel. And this is going to be done in 7 sections. The first is a relation between Schiller and Kant, the aesthetic sphere as a sphere of play according to Schiller, aesthetic education, Schiller's caution and rashness of the Romanticists. Then we'll look at Fichte and aesthetics, Schelling's aesthetics, which deals with art and philosophy, ideas and the gods, art and mythology, art, practice, and religion. And the last person we shall consider is J.W. Hegel and his aesthetic values. To begin with, Immanuel Kant and aesthetics. We should know that after Vico, the next European mind of real speculative genius is Kant, and that's why we say talk about speculative metaphysics. He took up the problem of philosophy where Vico laid it down, and Kant can pose as a man who discovered the problem of aesthetic, or solved it, or brought it within the sight of solution. He was at once unlike and less successful than Vico, but what Kant underlines, or his idea of art, strange enough, seems to be his recollection of the explicit insistence that war waged by him against the school of, he went against Christian Wolff and the concept of beauty. For with him, in relation to, he considers the concept of beauty as a perfection confusedly perceived. And we must assert here that Kant's idea of art was fundamentally the same as that of Baumgarten and the Wolffian school he reconciled with Christian Wolff later on. Kant, like Wolff and Baumgarten, considered logic and aesthetics, or the theory of art, as conjoined sciences, meaning they could be taken together, and this led him to propose, while expounding the critique of reason, to throw a glance at that and aspects of tastes, and this led him to say, or to state, that at aesthetics, since the rules of one apply to the other, and each throws light upon the other. So aesthetics, according to Kant, and logic, they go hand in hand. For this reason, Kant introduces another dimension, which for him is that of poetry, and he sees poetry as a harmonious play of thoughts and sensations. And poetry and eloquence differ in Kant. Sometimes it's thought that poetry he thinks as an anterior to eloquence, because sensations come before thoughts. For Kant, no concept is adequate to the aesthetic idea, as no representation of the imagination can ever possibly be adequate to the concept. So relating this in the aspects of truth, Kant thinks that we must make use of particular methods and employ aesthetical values to be able to ascertain truth. And that is why Later on, Hans-Georg Gadamer, in his Truth and Method, makes use of Kant's ideas of aesthetics and the idea of truth. For him, Kant says, when we say this is a beautiful woman, we merely mean that nature beautifully represents in the form of this woman her purpose in the construction of the female body. So it means that when we look at the particular woman, we're able to come at that. The first aspect of Kant's aesthetics is imagination. Baumgarten seems to have transported into a higher key, more concentrated, more elaborate, more suggestive, until from one moment or from moment to moment, it seems to be about the burst into a wholly different conception of art. But on the other hand, in relation to Kant and imagination, the profound concept of imagination for him was entirely lacking to Kant's system and his philosophy of the spirit. But then, glancing over the table of faculties of the spirit, which precedes his critique of judgment, we see that Kant coordinates with it the cognitive faculty, the feeling of pleasure and pain, and the appetitive faculty. To this effect, Kant corresponds the intellect to the second as first, second, judgment, which for him is a teleological and aesthetical value, and the third thing for Kant is reason. So in any work of art, Kant thinks the intellect comes first, judgment follows, and then reason. But in his critique of the first part of his critique of pure reason, Kant thinks that the much simpler, namely the pure intuition, is the totality of the a priori principles of sensibility. Nevertheless, after having so rightly postulated the necessity for a science of the forms of sensation or pure intuition, that which is known as purely intuitive knowledge, Kant goes on to simply state that because we have no exact idea of the nature of the aesthetic faculty and of art, to fall into an intellectualistic error by reducing the form of sensibility or pure intuition into the two categories of functions of space and time. Therefore, it leads him to assert that the spirit emerges from the chaos of sensation by organizing its sensations in space and time. The second aspect under Kant is his idea of differentiation of theory of beauty from art. Kant repeatedly opposes Wolff's school concerning the concept of art and that of beauty, which for him are quite distinct. According to him, Wolff made a mistake of taking them as one. First of all, he does not admit that sensation could be called confused knowledge, as Wolff had it, a confused form, that is, of intellectual cognition, rightly judging this to be a false account of sensibility, since for Kant, a concept, however confused, is always a concept or a rough sketch of a concept, never an intuition. For this reason, of the four moments, Kant calls them the four determinations, and he accords to beauty the two negative and as directed, one against the sensationalists, the other against the intellectualists. And for Kant, that which is beautiful pleases without interests, and the beautiful pleases without concepts. The last aspect of Kant is mystical futures. Kant seems to reintroduce again the old Greco-Roman antiquity idea of mysticism. Accordingly, Kant considers the other two moments as giving some kind of a definition of this region. For him, beauty is that which has the form of finality without a representation of an end. That is beauty which is the object of the universal pleasure. So the question raised is, what is this mysterious sphere? And another second question adding to it is, what is this disinterested pleasure we experience in pure colors and tones, in flowers, and even in apparent beauty when we make abstraction from the concept to which it adheres? Kant so emphatically criticizes the sensationalists and the intellectualists, and he does not show the same severity towards the Neoplatonics, so he sides with them. And Kant further made a curious distinction between form and matter. In music, melody. In music for Kant, melody is a matter and harmony the form. In a flower, the scent is the material and the shape is the form. Therefore, for Kant, the colors which illuminate the drawing belong to sensuous stimulus and may bring the object more vividly before the senses, but do not in any case, as he says, render it worthy of contemplation as a thing of beauty. The next section, we are going to consider the aesthetic of idealism, that of Schiller, Schelling, Sorge, and Hegel. Welcome to the last segment of our lectures this morning. We shall treat three basic aspects to conclude African aesthetics and sculpture, to conclude aspects of aesthetics in traditional African society. We shall examine art forms and religion, especially in relation to African traditional religion. We shall look at art forms and ancestral links. We shall look at aesthetics and African sculpture. Those are the three basic features that will help us to conclude this section. The first, art forms and religion. We must recall that religion is a dominant force in African life and society. We are used to the saying of John Beatty, one of the illustrious African traditional religion writers and African philosophers, who says that Africans are notoriously religious. This greatly determines the nature of African art forms. It is most often manifested in masks, sculpture, ancestor occult figures, fetishes, and reliquary figures. Sculptures that are considered to be religiously empowered are rarely displayed in public because that is confined only to those members, limited the elite few of such cultic groups, and are usually stored in small chambers and shrines. Some of them are also clothed and placed in containers made from gourds, in pots, or buried in the ground. In contrast, masks considered to be sculptures are meant to be seen, but ritual masks used in religious ceremonies are considered sacred, therefore they are always kept hidden. And while women rarely perform in mass rituals, many African myths suggest that mass rituals were initially created and performed by females. There are basically three rules of performance of ritual mass in African art forms and religion. The first is that the mask may be used to hide the identity of the person who is wearing it. For example, among the Dan culture of Liberia, the Diangle mask are feminine masks worn to collect and take food to boys in the seclusion stage of their tribal initiation, and these masks were used to withhold the food giver's identity. In our cultures, if you get to our various cultures, you will see the various. You just need to study and apply into your own culture. You'll be able to see such masks that are used to hide the identity of the person wearing it. The second is aspect of ritual masks in relation to art forms and religion is masks are used to free the wearer. A person that may hold a public position in African culture from their identity, they don't want to know that this is a person. When I look at this feature, what comes to my mind is the story of the white man of God and the Nko of the white man of God at the catechist. When the head of the Nko was pushed and the father, big father, realized that it was his catechist. So in most African cultures, masks are worn to free the wearer, a person that may hold a public position in the African culture from being identified. The last, or the third and the last, is masks allow the wearer to become something different or take on the identity of what the mask suggests or represents. For example, in ritual dance for ceremonies, the dancer ceases to be himself and becomes the spirit of the mask. From an artistic point of view, the objects may be either realistic or highly styled, and naturalistic and geometric shapes can combine to represent a recognizable human face. And we look at this in relation to wooden masks. When we look at wooden images for most tribes, especially maybe Mali and most semi-Bantu cultures, we see masks which are worn as headdress. And most of these masks, some of them, they have animal shapes on them, carved to depict those figures. Like you can look at jujus around the northwest region, maybe Oku jujus and all other jujus around the place. The second aspect is art forms and ancestral links. Cult and ancestral figures are full body images kept in homes. We get in most homes in African societies. We see art forms and the ancestral links, and these figures are presented for offerings on a daily ritualistic routine. Sometimes these figures indicate the social rank within the tribe, or any function or a fertility doll for a woman who is to get pregnant. And these sculptures may also be carved in the form of stools. Other figures may be carved holding an offering bowl or as mother and child figures. And we equally have art forms and ancestral links we have fetish figures designed to hold a set of ingredients endowed with a mystical power, and human forms to which many types of materials can be affixed, such as rope, string, feathers, or shells. And most often these figures they show a contribution of Africa. That Africa has so much great cultural heritage of mankind, and African sculpture was hardly known outside its own continent until the late 19th century. But during the 20th century, its effects on Western art have been immeasurable, and that's why we see most cultures and African countries canvassing for the return of some of their works of art that had been, I don't want to say stolen, taken away by colonial powers. The next aspect is aesthetic and African sculpture. The question we ask is, how does aesthetic affect an individual's understanding of African art and sculpture? And are there absolute standards of beauty which operate transculturally, or is there a specific aesthetic for each society? And we'll say that certainly in the American culture, for example, artistic appreciation and aesthetic are not the same as in African culture or in the Western world, where aesthetic generally has an ethical bent or twist and basis. In Africa, the ethical aspect is not so much implied in most of its sculpture. And in all African languages, the same word means beautiful and good. When you look at a description given to that which is beautiful, it's very often good. Take for instance in your culture. Let me look like the culture of the Nsọ people. When you say something is beautiful, the word you use is bong. When you say that something is good, the same word is bong. And I'm sure you can apply it to your own culture. You will see there are very few cultures. I know the Northwest, I think as of now, it is only the Com that may have two separate words for that. And sculptures are considered to be good if they fulfill their function and purpose. And the ethical and religious basis of African art may explain why human figure is the principal subject of African art. As a result, in African art or aesthetic, there are clearly standards of beauty. These standards are four with precise qualities. And to analyze these four qualities, we further use examples of maybe like the Yoruba of Nigeria, which describe a number of semi-independent peoples loosely linked in geography, language, and history and religion. And we want to isolate this piece, which Robert Thompson's research concerning the Yoruba of southern Nigeria, alongside the 5 characteristics that were enumerated. He says about the Jijora, a moderate resemblance to the Jijora sculpture of the Yoruba of Nigeria, and he clearly enumerates 5 aspects which have a corollary to the 5 characteristics that we already indicated earlier today. He talked about the sculpture of the Yoruba. It deals with visibility, and various parts of a sculpture should be clearly formed both in the initial stage of luminosity. The next is the whole sculpture offers a play of light containing blocking out of masses and in fine detail. A straight, upright, and symmetrical arrangement of the parts of the sculpture, representing the next aspect representing the subject in the prime of life, and the last aspect is the serenity or the serenity or colorlessness of the artwork. When we look at it clearly, the Yoruba sculpture equally has some twin figures that clearly represents work of art. And this eventually helps us to know that there is a lot of inner serenity leading to composed expressions, nobility and intelligence, exaggerated, smooth, and broad forehead indicating intelligence. And each of the possibilities evokes unpleasant memories of scholarly thesis. And we equally have a good number of people in the Yoruba culture who construct twin figures to depict maybe the death of a twin or the desire of the family to have a twin. We'll end there for today. Thank you and have a nice day.